Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Kineo Conversation. My name is Andy Costello, and I'm Head of Customer Solutions here at Kineo. Thank you for joining us today for the latest in our Kineo Conversations webinar series. As I hope you know, for each event, we feature a different subject matter expert or experts to join the Kineo team and explore a key topic of interest. Today, we're focusing on the topic of skills, reskilling and upskilling, a topic that has risen to the top of the agenda for many organizations over the last year, as we all look forward to a rapidly changing world of work and of learning. I'm joined today by a panel who have in-depth experience, knowledge and know-how in this area, so I shall let them introduce themselves to you now. Kirstie, first of all, please introduce yourself.
Hello, Andy. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, Kirstie Donnelly. I'm the CEO of City and Guilds.
Thank you, Kirstie. Next up, Don.
I'm Don Taylor. I'm the chairman of the Learning Technologies Conference, among other things. That's probably why I'm here today.
Thank you, Don. And finally, Emily.
Hello, I'm Emily, one of Kineo's learning consultants based in our Brighton office in the UK. Well, you know, when I'm not working from home anyway.
Thank you, a prestigious panel indeed. Look, before we get into the chat, as a reminder for those watching, please do add your questions into the Q&A tool, as we've reserved the last 15 minutes or so at the end of the session for your questions. Look, we'd love you to join the conversation, so let us know any questions that you have, and my colleague Alex will be keeping an eye on things as we come to the Q&A at the end. We've also got the chat function open today as well, so do feel free to add your comments as we go, and just make sure, of course, that you select panelists and attendees if you'd like everyone to see your comment. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation, shall we? Don, hello. I'm going to come to you first of all. Now, earlier this year, you published your Global Sentiment Survey looking at the impact of COVID. Now, the results showed that reskilling, upskilling went straight to the #1 spot. What do you think that says about L&D over the last 18 months?
I've been musing about this, Andy, for the past 6 months, because a lot of people said, hang on, that's just our job, reskilling and upskilling people. So cheesily, and as if I'm a rather C-rate politician, I'm going to hand this one over to the audience and just ask them, I'll put it in chat, why do you think that reskilling and upskilling are hot? So please, if you've got an opinion on this, your opinion may be it's nonsense, because that's our job in learning and development. And there's no reason why it should be any hotter this year than any other year. If you've got an opinion on that, please drop it into the chat. Let us know about it and we'll reflect on it. But Andy, to come back with my view on this, initially I was very concerned. I thought we'd all just jumped on board this effectively neologism, this new term that had been invented, reskilling and upskilling, which, as I say, is just our job. But if having a look at it underneath the bonnet and really thinking about it, I've come to the conclusion that the reason why those two terms are so popular and why we've sort of latched onto them is they are a convenient bucket to throw things into that are happening at the moment in learning and development in very different areas. So we've got multinational bodies and we've got governments with reskilling, upskilling campaigns. We've got companies doing it, and we've got even individual departments wanting to do it. So it covers an awful lot of ground, even though those things may be slightly different. And one way in which you can look at reskilling and upskilling is it could be specific and it could be general. The specific stuff is an organization saying we need more data scientists. It could be very general. We just need everybody to be able to work online. So that's two very different sort of jobs, two very different tasks you're taking on from a learning point of view. It can be tactical, right, we're going to get this done now, we need cybersecurity people immediately. Or it can be quite strategic, like Unilever's doing. We need to train everybody by 2025 for a new future of work. And because it covers so many spaces, and yet we use the same things for it, same words for it, I think that's why it's proven to be so popular. And it's not just my survey either. LinkedIn learning survey for this year, 59% of L&D people said it was the most important thing on their agenda. You need both parts, says Dennis. I'm just looking at the chat here. Stuart says the skills of the past will not be sufficient to build the future. I think Kirstie will have a few things to say about that. Speed of technology, remote working, trad education is obsolete, Miriam says, by the time you get to apply. And Cami Bean, good to see Cami here. Lately, I'd say it's due to this is a new one on me, the turnover tsunami. Yeah, there's an awful lot of that going on. But here's the thing, Cami, these terms, I looked at Google Trends, these terms have been super hot and picking up since about June of 2019. So they've been bubbling under for quite a long time. But you're quite right. Lately, that's the thing that's driving it. I can speak about this all day long, as you can see, Andy. But I'm going to shut up now.
Clearly, well, look, there was an article in the LA Times, I believe, which was called the summer of quitting, which everybody was expecting to see sweep from from across the Atlantic over here. I don't think we've seen it just yet, but clearly that's one of the reasons why this is top of the agenda, and it's quite a way on top of your league list, above the second place. I think it's 13%.
13%, which is the highest number for a top ranked option on that list for 5 years.
Wow.
And across all demographics, so wherever you work, and across 5 of the 6 regions in the world. So historically, demographically, geographically, it is everyone's backing it.
Great, thank you, Don. Kirstie, I'm going to come to you next. Now, City and Guilds have also published the first skills index in collaboration with MZ that we know very, very well. What were some of the findings that stood out for you, and how does it kind of correlate with what we found in Don's survey?
Yeah, well, I sort of relate to a lot of what Don's just been saying. I mean, I think for me, retraining, reskilling. I mean, for me, the common word is about skills, actually, and you know, that's a word that's been around for a long, long time. It pre-COVID, we were talking about the problems that we were facing around the sort of all the macro trends around AI, aging population, just changing workforces, and of course then we saw the impact of COVID and the pivot that we've made. And so we did the skills index really because there's a lot of, as Don I think suggested, there's a lot of heat and noise around this topic, but when it comes to it, productivity is really most impacted by talent, and talent is most impacted by the skills, the training that people have, and all the evidence points to the fact that just not enough of that is going on. Quite simply, employers generally, for all the good that lots of them do, there is just not enough systematic investment in skills and in retraining and reskilling, and we see evidence of that time and time again. And I'm not putting all this at the foot of employers either way, by the way, because of course on the other side of the coin is the supply side. How good is the supply side at being able to predict the futurology of where do these retraining, reskilling needs to most take place? And so in what we tried to do with the skills index report, and it is a first for us, and we now, having produced the one we produced a couple of months ago, we are going to do it annually, because I think the whole power in this is being able to see year on year what are the changing trends, because we've tended to prepare in the past, I think, as a society, educationally, even in employers, for things that are going to last 5, 10, 15, 20 years, whereas what we're seeing now are things that are in the moment, 3 months, a year. And so how do we start to equip ourselves? So one of the things that came out of the skills index report that I thought was absolutely fascinating and relates to some of the conversation we're having here, you know, we looked at the top technical skills, top 10 technical skills employers were looking for, the top 10 common skills, and then the top 10 emerging skills. And this was across 2,000 employers. And all of them, to less or a greater degree, all talk to a COVID pandemic, i.e. all the skills in there were being influenced by what was happening right here, right now, you know, whether it was video conferencing skills, care skills, basic life support, having a good driving record, whether it was nursing, mental health. And so I suppose what that did was sort of reinforce this point that skills are very much in the moment. So, you know, whilst they'll always exist and we'll always need to keep reskilling and retraining, in terms of thinking about the 5-decade career, we need to be constantly keeping our hand on the pulse of what is changing in the moment, and then what are the most effective ways and cost-effective ways, of course, for employers to be able to keep a pace with that, in terms of how can learning be delivered that actually gets those skills right where they're needed, when they're needed. So there's a lots of things that have come out of the skills index report, and I'm sure as we go through the conversation I'll talk some more, but I think a lot of it does ladder back to some of the things that Don was saying at the beginning.
I know one of the things that stood out is the mismatch between the skills that people need and the skills they're able to recruit on. And what do you think the driving focus is on this?
Well, I think what we definitely found through the research, I think we found it more broadly. I mean, you look at the amount of people who have literally been in good jobs for sustained periods of time, where they've just seen that industry decimated. Look at travel, look at retail, look at in catering. We could literally keep reeling off some of and even at a sub-occupational level. And yet think about all of those transferable skills, and think about all of that learning that has existed with those individuals. So I think one of the things that we've seen very much a trend and looking at to do more about is, how do we help people take those common skills, if we can just call them that for now, and those transferable skills that they may have got from that particular industry, and help them skills bridge. Help them create a skills bridge between where they were to where they may want to go. But it does come back to what I was saying a moment ago, really, Andy, is that has to be delivered not through some long, and you might be surprised for me to hear this as a CEO of the largest sort of vocational awarding body, it's not all about a qualification. It's not all about a big long program. It's about a short, sharp skills intervention that can be verified, credentialed, recognized, and give somebody the confidence, as well as the employer the confidence, that they are getting somebody who can do the job at hand. So I think that transferability, that fusion skill, whatever language you want to apply to it, I think that's certainly been a common theme as we've come through this year, as well as then some very specific technical skills and emerging skills that I was mentioning before, where people are having to take on board much greater understanding of operating in a hybrid workplace, and Zoom skills, video conferencing, etc.
So these skills, and I'll open this back out to the panel, these skills that you're talking about here, the short, sharp sort of delivery of skills, the soft skills, or for want of a better phrase, and the topics you've talked about, they're fairly, you'd think, obvious and straightforward, and potentially quite easily to develop in-house. So should that be a priority for employers and for workplace training? It's something that they should absolutely be taking on and delivering as a without question. Who wants to take that? Digital, where could digital fit?
I'll chip in there. I mean, I think this is where digital can really help. Because actually those skills are, we're dealing with kind of open-ended things, aren't we? They're not they can be complex, and the benefit of digital is that it can allow you, let's think about things like interactive branching scenarios and so on. But also, blended learning. So, you can just cover a single concept at one time, but then you can repeat that later at a later date. So you're not bombarding people. But also, I think what's really key is that you're allowing people to practice these skills in a safe environment, aren't you? And I think there are two elements there, really. There's obviously the fact that, some people are just naturally less inclined to want to do that kind of thing in a face-to-face setting, but also, a lot of the workforce have felt the brunt of the last 18 months, and their confidence is lacking, their confidence in their kind of career skill set, but maybe even just their social skills. And so, being able to do that in the safe environment that digital allows, I think is important. And I think also when, I'm referring to digital, but actually it's much broader than that. It's learning technologies, there are so many ways in which we can support people, with capability academies, coaching, mentorship, virtual workshops, face-to-face workshops. Everything comes into that blend. So we just have so many options in which we can tackle that, I think.
I think Emily pick on a really good point there, because I think, what we're talking about there is it's no longer digital and blended solutions for those who are slightly more inclined to learn that way or think that way. We're having to now adopt it as a behavioural mindset in terms of how do you impart your knowledge, how do you impart empathy, how do you look at ways to create engagement and behaviours, because a lot of what we're talking about here when it comes to skills as well, and some of you saying before, Andy, those softer skills, it's about culture, it's about behaviour, it's about mindset. And if you can get that right, and then use emerging learning technologies to try and create that and network that, then you can start to layer and build on to that, then some of the more specific, more technical skills that might be then required to do a very specific technical job. But I think what I was really struck with when we did the skills index research you mentioned before, was that 30% of people we spoke to, so as well as speaking to these 2,000 employers, we also spoke to well over 1,000 employees. So it's a pretty decent sample size. And over 30% have not received any training in the last 5 years.
Gosh.
And then when you got to people over the age of 55, that jumped to 45%. So I think that's quite shocking when we think about the skills gaps that we keep hearing about and we know that are impacting our productivity, and yet you overlay those sorts of statistics. I mean, it might be something Don, I'm sure, can comment on. You know, you start what is going wrong there? Why is it that learning technology or employers' investment in it, why are we not being able to get them to see the correlation between addressing that and their productivity? Because I think that's pretty woeful, that those statistics, really.
They are. And just to add a positive note to that, I was really overjoyed recently to hear that some recent training we delivered to a loneliness charity in Brighton was actually received by volunteers aged between 14 and 80, which I felt really spoke to the sort of unbiased nature, the potential unbiased nature of digital learning, you know, in terms of its ease of access, assuming you've got, you know, access to the internet, of course, which, you know, there's still a divide there. But you know, there is untapped potential, and I think that's the really great thing about digital learning, that you don't have to wait for a senior executive in a room to say, yes, you're allowed to go on this training course. It's there, you know, you can grab it, you can use it, you can, you know, develop your career skills and your personal skills in any which way that you like.
You mentioned the divide there, and you know, there's still a bit of an imbalance, but people by and large have access to it. So if we need to shift to a skills-based view of the workforce rather than jobs, roles, qualifications, and if we want to respond to the changing the skills requirements that are changing rapidly and support employees with the bite-sized learning, what needs to change in business? How do businesses need to change, do you think? Don, I'm going to bring you back in here.
I think above all, there needs to be a change in the mindset of the of everybody in the business, but particularly the senior executives, who and it's almost inevitable, because this is how we've organized people and learning for since time immemorial. But people are organized into jobs. People are convenient receptacles of skills that make things happen in an organization, and the jobs are the things into which we put those receptacles. That's how the people who are running organizations see it. The truth about employment and the way jobs can be done, tasks can be done efficiently in the future, is much more around finding loose teams that come together to tackle particular tasks, then are broken up and come together in new ways to do similar things, but possibly in different ways in different parts of the organization. And one person could have a different role, a very different role, of leading one team and being a junior member of another. And that won't be determined, or it shouldn't necessarily be determined, by hierarchy. Now, the ability of organizations to understand this and to take it seriously is really quite challenging, because all of the hierarchical setup that we have around organizing people is based on essentially a factory system of an industrial system of working that's more or less been the same since about the beginning part of the 19th century with Watt and Bolton setting up their initial factories. And it's been consolidated in various ways since then. And if you are asking people to change that, it's not a simple matter of saying, well, choose the blue one rather than the red one. You're trying to get people to undergo an entire lifetime of assumptions about how all things are organized. So that's what needs to be done in order to shift how we organize work and how we think about people's skills in relation to them and in relation to work. We need to shift the mindset of the people who are employing those people and setting the systems up. But it's a huge task. I'm not qualified to say how we go about shifting those people's mindsets. I'm sure Kirstie has some brilliant ideas.
Nicely done. Kirstie, you're nodding away there. Please come in.
I was certainly nodding away what Don was saying. I'm not sure about the brilliant ideas. I was struck by, funny enough, as Don was speaking, when I see somebody's mentioned it in the chat as well. I mean, there is that sort of notion of, needing to unlearn to relearn. There is something here about picking back at some of our, just some of our wholly ingrained disciplines in the construct of workplaces, hierarchies, and even the education system. I think the reason I was nodding so much to what Don was saying about that whole industrialization of a model, and it starts in education, right? I mean, I was saying before the call, but next week is A-levels weeks. What the majority of those young people who are going to be anxiously waiting, well, slightly differently anxiously waiting this next week, because it's a slightly different exam system at the moment, of course. But, what are they waiting to do? Well, they're waiting to know that probably still, even today, despite everything we're talking about, still choose university, but not necessarily because they see it as the absolute value for money or the way that they really will get to where they want to get to, but because they're frightened about the other alternatives, or they're not sure about the other alternatives, to know that there will be an opportunity for them in something as great as an apprenticeship, or even a job where they know an employer is going to give them that support, and as well as that network and access to training. So there is something about us undoing some of the systems that we've got so used to, that I think Don was talking to just then.
And if I may, I think that I talked earlier about how reskilling, upskilling is like a handy big bucket into which lots of different people are throwing their ideas. But I think what's driving that, whatever the ideas are, whether it's a government saying we need to reskill, like in Singapore, we need to have a huge initiative across our entire working population, or it's an employer saying they need to do something. The drivers are all the same, which is it's driven by the changing nature of work. So it is something that's reasonably new. And that changing nature of work needs to be accompanied by a changing nature of both education and also workplace learning. Unfortunately, education, for lots of reasons, is a very difficult thing to change. And so is workplace learning, because of people's concepts. And if you wanted to try to have a system whereby you were going to persuade an entire population about something, you would do it as we do it at the moment with education, which is you'd make everybody, regardless of their gender, race, background, class, go through exactly the same process from the year 7 to 18. And so people come out of that thinking, well, that's how we learn. And we are vessels to be filled up better or worse and more or less efficiently with information. And of course, it's not. It's one way of learning, but it's not the only way of learning. And it unfortunately casts a shadow over our whole thinking about how people can learn in the workplace, and also how our skills can be used in the workplace. And so we end up with an unwritten assumption, a tacit assumption across everybody, which is that, yeah, well, that's the way it is. Of course, it's the way it is. Nobody questions, actually, it is possible to learn things in different ways. So Emily, you were saying, look, we can have this stuff available. People can go and they can learn stuff for themselves. Of course they can, but it's always, and we know this is the case, a limited number of people who actually are autodidacts, willing and enthusiastic about learning for themselves. Most people don't exactly have to be pushed, but they have to be at least guided, because that's how everything has been set up, and it's how the whole system is and what's expected of people. So mindset doesn't just apply to the executives in the organization. Actually, we did change everybody's mindset about how we learn and work.
And that's a cultural piece, isn't it? Which is a huge take on. How do we go about building or working towards a mature culture of research?
And I was going to say, if I may, Andy, come on that and mention Singapore. I mean, one of the findings, funny enough, in the report, the skills index report that we started off talking about, and it may sound a little grandiose, so forgive me, but it is about literally a cultural revolution in creating a new approach to lifelong learning that recognises a 5-decade career.
Yeah.
Really easy to say. To Don's point, how do we make that happen? Because it's a cultural systematic change, because it's about governments, if you're looking at it from a global point of view, but let's just stay in the UK for now. So it'd be about the UK government, and then employers coming together, and then the role of the individual, the employee themselves. It is almost a tripart agreement that would almost has to take place between what the government's willing to do to enable that kind of lifelong culture, to look at the rolling off, the handoff points between statutory education, as Don was just describing, into then that lifelong learning career. What's the role of the government to incentivise that to continue beyond statutory education? What's the role of the employer in and continue to invest in that? And what's the role of the individual actually in their responsibility in engaging in it, and even potentially investing in their lifelong learning entitlement? So I think it's that kind of cultural revolution, as well as at the system level. And when I say at the system level, I'm talking at the macro system level, that we need to put right. And Singapore are a really interesting example, because of course they are doing exactly that. They are talking about a lifelong learning culture where they are funding all sorts of learning that isn't even economically what they need right now in the country, but they recognise by doing that they will switch people's minds and brains, hearts and minds onto learning, and then de facto that will become the way people will think, and then they will start to do more and more that invests in the kind of skills that are needed to continue to make Singapore even more productive. So, you know, I just think it's an interesting model, Don, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because it's something that I've certainly looked at around this whole cultural point, really.
It's interesting. You've got a question, a comment came up, Don, on it. I've seen you've replied to Miriam about Moocs, and in the question chat as well, which kind of links into it. It's what's the panel's view on the growth of mass online, mass offline learning in China, and then China's subsequent crackdown on these platforms. So, bit of a hot one, but it kind of talks into the mass online, the Moocs that you flagged there, Don.
Well, they haven't cracked down on the learning. What they've cracked down on is people making a profit out of it. So I think that's the key thing. They for whatever reason, there can be lots of reasons around this, but it could be the Chinese government would say they want to continue with the socialist state where there is no differentiation in terms of opportunity in terms of how much money you've got. That would be the line they would take. There is no doubt there is a tremendous amount of fascinating and sometimes quite scary work around learning and education coming out of China. I think also with the Singapore experiment, it's very important to note that Singapore is a unique example of a democratic, autocratic country that's basically a city-state where it is possible to get things done quite quickly in quite a well-defined way. Probably wouldn't apply elsewhere. Miriam is saying that Moocs are, by the way, Andy, look, what I love is I haven't provided any answers here whatsoever. It's been throwing questions back at you, but the audience are, and this is why I love these things, the audience is providing all the answers. Miriam's and Cami is saying that Moocs are exploding in the US. And I'd like to just discuss for a second, whose responsibility is it to do this? I think, and I've been having lots of conversations around this recently with startups. In the US, there is still, I think, a tradition that it is the individual's responsibility to skill themselves. I think in the UK and Europe, it's much more seen as being the role of the state and government. I don't know what everybody else on the panel thinks about that, but it may be that's one of the reasons driving the adoption of Moocs in the US.
I mean, I'd agree, really, Don. I think that's kind of what I was getting at a moment ago about this cultural revolution needed over here, because I think I've forgotten the statistic, but I think at post-tertiary level in the US, Cami may have it if she's online, but it's a very big percentage, like in the 90s, of people who then post-tertiary, individuals see it as their responsibility to invest in their continuing professional development. When we did a similar survey in this UK as part of the skills index, I think it was something like 6%. So 6% of people would be willing right now to invest in their own learning and development. So a big gap there. And I think that does go back to something you and I have just been discussing on this panel, really, about how people have been fed a particular system for so long. And we've had a lot of government intervention in skills and education. And there is a question, which is, where should government intervention stop and actually let the market and the forces and the consumer and the employer sort of take over? So, which I think is very much more the American model. So I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a long way for us to go before individuals will really see the value in investing those pounds that they need to in their own continuing professional development. But I do think Moocs, or those shorter bite-sized license to practice, we would call them competency-based learning. I think if we can show the value between doing that and the leveling up, or the extra money you may earn, or the opportunities it may open, I think we'll start to close that gap here. And I think people are starting to get hungrier for that now, actually, because they know it's their only way out of the sort of employment, low skill, low pay trap that they might find themselves in.
I wanted to bring Emily in here as well, because there's sort of tricks to the not tricks to the trade, but other sort of incentives and rewards for that self-determined approach. So building the culture is one thing, but also wanting to lead your own learning experience and drive your own learning, and recognizing not just the organization recognizing the value in you, but finding your own value. So we've got things across the group like digital credentials that can open up pathways and things. Emily, what's your sort of take on that, and other ways that we can, bringing it down a bit, that we can digitally support and drive that self-determined?
And I will get to that, but just firstly to speak to Don's point, which I entirely agree with, that some people are going to be much more self-led and self-directed than others. But I do think, as we've been talking about, the kind of need may impact that, and drive people to do more, to develop themselves. And I also think the shift to the skills, if we're looking at, the skills we need as opposed to the job descriptions that we need, that's going to help employees as well, if I'm honest. Job descriptions still often include this really vague kind of woolly list of competencies that, I for one find very hard to grasp and measure myself against. A skill, on the other hand, is something that I think you kind of either have and you haven't, and it's easier to know, what you're sort of working towards achieving. I've never really known anyone refer to a competency after an interview or, part of their induction. I think they're much more interested in whether they're performing well and how they're comparing with their peers. And, I think skills, that's the language we use to talk about our own growth. So I don't think it just helps employers to look at a skills-based view of the workforce. I think it helps employees too. And I think it creates a fairer playing system as well, because, occupations may become obsolete, but skills can be transferable. And I think you're absolutely right to mention credentialing, because I think that can really help break down into a very modular sort of view as to how you might progress throughout your career. We're doing great things with City and Guilds on the credentialing, and in terms of doing that, but also organisations can be doing that in terms of competency and skills based matrices to really give people a development path that they can work towards. And I just think it's so much more tangible to think of it in terms of skills. We may, job descriptions may not exist in the future, but skills will. And it may be that I'm assessed, if I apply for a job, I'm assessed on my various skill sets that, could, in the old days could have been drawn from various job descriptions. And I think there's a huge amount of potential there that will help enable, and empower learners to.
The language thing as well. I mean,
yeah.
Kirstie, you've got a good point in there. That's just scroll up my page. Ban the job description. Bring in behavioural skills credentials that we can measure. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Just come off mute there. Well, just really just that really. I think Emily's just really articulated brilliantly, which is there are so many different depths and levels and variety of skills and behaviours that people will collect and collate through the multiplicity of experiences that we're now going to have, as Don says, in this changing face of a workplace now. I mean, none of us know what it's going to be like to work over the next 12, 18, 24 months in what is going to be a new hybrid workplace. Just think about the skills that's going to take and the behaviours so how do we measure those? How do we find frameworks that allow people to have those recognised and verified as a credential, even so that you can take that on to your next employer or your next project or your next assignment. Or we're doing you've already, Emily, said a lot of great things about what we're doing, but we're already trying to walk the talk inside across City and Guilds as a whole organisation and look at leadership frameworks and take all of that so that we can really understand a more agile way to deploy our skill sets across specific projects, irrespective of the product brand that you might feel most aligned to. Where do we most want to collate these teams that mean we can more agilely move them across the organisation in a way that they get some real benefit from and acquire some new skills and new learnings, but the organisation ultimately is going to get the benefit from, rather than being stuck with these very static, hierarchical, functional structures. I think it's just a thing of the past. We just need to move away from them, quite frankly.
Don, you asked for it and they've responded. We're getting some fantastic engagement from the States and the support programs that seem to be in place. But you've made a comment there that I wanted you just to broaden about the question you asked on LinkedIn. Who's responsible for learning?
I was amazed by this. I asked of these four groups, the individual, the employer, the government, and the educational system, who's responsible for learning? And I thought there'd be a fairly even split, but 88% of people said it was the individual. Now, and I was expecting to be able to, first I was expecting about 100 people to reply. I was rather surprised at nearly 1,500. But I looked at the people who had responded that it was the individual, and there wasn't a clear pattern, that it was the anything other than the individual. There wasn't a clear pattern there. I was hoping my prejudices would be confirmed, as we always are when we do these things, and that people from France would all say it was the state. People from England would all say it was the employer, and from the Americas, they'd all say it was the the individual. But it was actually not like that. Everyone was pumping in. But I think this is something to do. I think it's a self-selecting group, unfortunately, that I follow on LinkedIn. So I'm afraid, although I was fascinated by the results of this, I'm not sure we can take it very seriously, because I'm afraid that it shows probably what the learning and development professional people associated with it feel, rather than what the general population feels.
Yeah, the reality. I think that's right, because if you put that against what I was saying before, and obviously everybody's research will come at a different angle depending on the questions asked, but you take that 6%, who said that they would only be okay. I mean, that's pretty stark in a working age population of a couple of thousand people. So,
but I looked recently at how the training levy works in France. The compte professionnel, something, I can't remember what it is exactly, and how it works. It is an immensely complicated system for ensuring that the money taken off employers, and it's a certain percentage of payroll for a certain number of certain size of organization, then gets put back in return for training that is done against a recognized roster of things that are okay. And actually, until quite recently, that had to be face-to-face training, which meant that there was a lot of classroom training, which meant that about 40% of that levy was spent on language training, because it was the one thing that was very easy to do and quite well done in the classroom. Now, that's a ridiculous unintended consequence, that you put in place a levy system with a good intent, and you find it's entirely skewed, or the biggest majority of it is skewed towards language learning. Nothing against language learning, but it's not where the greatest gap of skills probably is. So there's a lot to be said for giving people the choice with their money and letting them follow it. Even that isn't without its problems. Kirstie, you'll remember the individual learning accounts from the early 2000s, and how it was absolutely riven, unfortunately, with unscrupulous providers who actually took the whole system for a ride.
No, absolutely, Don, and that's why I was referring before about, there's, the need for a lifelong learning culture, and there's no doubt, I mean, without getting into lots of government policy, but quite recently, for those of you who had any interest in it, the skills bill was published. It was quite clearly written in there. This is the government skills bill, setting out what they expect to see in terms of policy around skills. And one of the things they want to do is reintroduce, they're not calling it an individual learning account for all the reasons you just mentioned. And I do remember very well that system. And actually, what's a shame about that? Conceptually, it was absolutely right.
It was so close.
It was just poorly thought through. And actually, greatest respect, or not greatest respect, to government sometimes, the worst thing you do as a government is let them design a piece of policy. But actually, I think we will start to see something around a lifelong learning entitlement. And if that entitlement can start to be absolutely linked to some choice, as you're saying, Don, and people can start to see that by them investing as well, whether it's time or even some of their own money, it is going to lead to a better outcome, then I think we'll start to see a kickstart happening in terms of changing people's mindset around what the responsibility they need to take for their own learning and development.
And just to sort of speak to that point, I think that again is where digital learning can come into its own, because you are providing potentially the convenience. If you're having to pay for learning, you're never, well, if you're having to pay for anything, you're never going to pay for something that's inconvenient. So the learning has to be convenient to you. And the great thing about digital is that obviously you can do it at home, within your working patterns, your family life, working life, whatever, and still earn at the same time.
Exactly. It was interesting that Don, you said that up until recently, face-to-face training was such a big deal in France. I wonder what happened that may have put a bit of a stop to.
I can't imagine.
No, exactly.
But can I just
go on.
one other point because I was curious about, because we hear a lot as well these days about how employees are staying with the organisations that invest in them and their development. I think the statistics are something. I think they're quite staggering. It's 94% of people will stay within an organisation if they feel invested in. So that's slightly at odds, isn't it, with this notion that as an individual, you're responsible for your own development. So I was curious, what you thought really.
I think people want the investment, and it may be that the most efficient way of doing it in terms of the market is that individuals decide where it goes. But you're absolutely right, of course. I think there was a recent report from Mercer that said that LinkedIn Learning where people are being invested in, they will stay for 5.4 years versus 2.9 years when they're not invested in. With Mercer, it was 81% of people feel they are thriving at work versus 12% feel they're not thriving. And the thriving means that they are being, they feel they're being invested in. So people who feel they are thriving are, and there are other stats in that report, much more likely to stay. So invest in people, they stay. Now that shouldn't be why you invest in people, because if you invest in people just to reduce turnover, there are lots of other ways of doing it. You can give them more leave, you can give them more money or whatever. But if you do invest in them, you get the added bonus, of course, that they actually do their jobs better as well. So there's plenty of evidence, as you say, Emily, that if we do invest in people, yeah, they're going to stay. You just need employers who are big enough to grasp the nettle and accept that people will be happy to stay and they will leave.
Yeah,
they will leave eventually. But you know what? It's part of the gig.
And sometimes that's right, isn't it? Sorry, Kirstie. I was just going to say there's the adage, isn't there, that one of the big concerns about people investing in people is what if we spend all this money investing in people and they leave, and the response is what if we don't and they stay. It's a big
purpose, isn't it? On to the next job.
Precisely, but bringing it back to our industry as well, I think that's really, really important. And the personalization of that, the individual value that you can give through a digital response, personalizing the learning, the credentialing, etc., is a really, really simple way of doing it. Probably much harder than a traditional sort of face-to-face classroom-based approach for obvious reasons. But we've got a few minutes before Q&A, and I just wanted to ask that to the panel as well. As learning technologies and the tools progress, data analytics, how do we think this is helping organizations map as well as manage skills? Who wants to take that one?
How long have you got? Because that is a 2-week answer, definitely. And everyone talks about it. I'm hearing a lot at the moment about people getting an implication of what skills are. So looking through data sets and understanding what skills are by the phrases that people use, the thing they've done and so on. I am frankly skeptical. I'm happy to be proved wrong, but I'm skeptical that any artificial intelligence algorithm at the moment can look at somebody's activity and decide what skills they've got. I just think it is too complicated, and I think you end up. That's one thing. The second thing is you can have a sort of folksonomy approach to skills, where you say, well, okay, folks, what skills do you think you've got? What skills do you think this content applies to? And you do that, and you end up with a folksonomy where every skill has 20 different phraseologies around it and 100 different definitions. And then you're trying to compare apples with oranges when you're trying to use those skills to say, well, Bob is doing this job but would like to do that job, and therefore we should give them the opportunity to do this training, which is the point, or have these learning interventions. And if you've got a rigorous approach to that, you can supply some really good learning interventions. But if it's a bit loose and fluffy, everyone's chipped their 5 penn'orth worth into what the skill definition is. It's too loose, it's too vague, and you could end up providing Bob with 100 opportunities for learning, none of which really quite does the job. So coming back to the point, I think, Andy, that if we are, and there is so much discussion around this amendment quite rightly, because it's another bit, if we want to really shift from using certifications that we took 2 years, 10 years ago, as a rough proxy for people's ability into some view of actually what skills have they really got. If we want to do that, those skills have to be really well defined, and they have to be not just defined but also maintained by somebody. I would say an external body rather than the organization itself, in such a way that they are constantly up to date and valuable. That's not a trivial task, and it's that absence of a valid, valued and valuable alternative to out-of-date certifications from a long time ago. It's that absence of that alternative, which means that the degree that you got 10 years ago still becomes something which people use, because there isn't any alternative way of doing it at the moment. But I think we're shifting there. By the way, I have a degree in politics, philosophy and economics. Strangely, all of those things have helped me in my job, but I'm neither a politician, philosopher, nor a economist.
Interesting. No, I can talk about that for a long time. Emily, you very politely got your hand up, and then last word to Kirstie. But Emily first. A minute, please.
Yeah, no, I just couldn't agree more, and that was absolutely my first reaction as well. I could reel off and a list of things, ways in which data can help you, analyze your, the effectiveness of your learning and give you insights about your learners and so on, that I think can be valuable. But I think at the moment we're jumping on the data bandwagon, and I think we're kind of forgetting actually that there's a lot of grunt work involved in mapping and managing skills that's kind of outside of the technologies and the tools. And there are tools that can help you, but actually if you were to come up with a skills matrix for your organization, for example, you wouldn't want to just grab a generic one online. You would, to drive performance, you would really need to make it specific to your business and directly tie, your strategy to your technical, your soft, your emerging skills, all of those things at every kind of job function at every level of the business. And as Don says, that's really no small task.
Yeah.
And I think also, you would, sorry, I'm nearly a minute.
No, you're good. You're good.
You would
I took all your time,
ideally
Emily. I'm sorry. I was talking too much.
it's fine.
We've
But
got time.
you would write that in a universal language as well. I mean, my dream is that actually you would identify a series of skills for your entire organization, and then you would map those at levels throughout the organization. And that would really give someone a kind of progression pathway to work through.
Let's do it.
But to aid that internal mobility, but it that skills matrix has to be dynamic, and you need to refresh it constantly as
it's living being beast, of course.
So it's a big role, and I don't think we should get sidetracked by data so much that we forget actually we're talking about the skills we need for the future, and that is a human one for me first and foremost, and data and technology can support that, but it's a human task.
Fantastic. Thank you. Wise words. Brilliant. Kirstie, last thoughts before we go to Q&A.
Goodness, I think it's all been said. I mean, I think probably, I think all I would say is probably what Emily and Don have just touched on is exactly why we did the skills index this year, because we want to start to get to that kind of granular look at what is starting to happen. I'm probably a bit more optimistic that I think we can start to use data and AI in some more sophisticated ways where we can sort of start to get from these very macro headings down to something that is actually more meaningful to the human, to the individual, that goes, okay, I can identify with that, and I can start to plot and see how I can take the skills I've got now and get these new skills and add them on. But I don't think it'll be easy. And skills taxonomies is exactly the way we need to go. I think language, as Emily's just touched on, and in fact I seem to recall one of the recommendations of the 4 we made in the skills index report was to think about data as an enabling part of that and those taxonomies. But we do need a universal language for skills, and that sounds like that's a big thing to try and achieve, but we probably do now. Whether it's universal or whether you bring it down and you have your own universal language inside your own organization, but it probably all still ladders back to something that you can relate to and you can take with you. So even if you move organization and the language is slightly changed or the meaning slightly changed, you're able to relate those skills you learn there into whatever your new role will be. But it's a big job that lies ahead of us, there's no doubt about it, but I think it's the prize that's worth going for, because I think it's a thing that will actually help close the gap on what is actually this tension between hiring someone and the skills they've got, and how do you close that kind of hiring and skills gap that I think is what we're faced with today, really.
Fantastic, thank you. It's almost as if 47 or 8 minutes isn't enough to answer that question, but that's brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. But let's see if others are forthcoming. Alex, would you be able to join us, please, and bring in some of the Q&A that we've received, and let's see how we do in the next sort of 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, great chat. Thank you, Andy. So one of the questions that's come in here from Miriam is, what do the panelists think about the role of LXPs, so learning experience platforms, in driving the focus on skills in organisations?
Oh, panel.
I'm going to let Don start with that one.
I had a feeling you were going to do that. Of course, as you know, the chairman of the Learning Technologies Conference for the last 21 years, you'd expect me to be cock-a-hoop about LXPs. I am utterly neutral on the idea of technologies. One thing I'll say is this: for 21 years, I've sat on the stage listening to speakers promising that something is the answer, and it never is. So the only thing I can say is not that LXPs are bad, but they are not the solution. The solution is never technology. The solution is always how people use that technology and how they get behaviors to change in an organization.
That's exactly why I asked Don to answer that, and it was almost like we'd scripted it, because that would be exactly, and having gone to a number of those over the years, and goodness, I mean, there are so many on the Don conversations that you could just replay year after year, and so many sectors. And if I just come back to, say, the further education sector, so the supply side, how much money was spent on the equivalent of what an LXP would have been. The language back then was, simply, I don't think it was learning, I think it was just trying to remember what the language was, how unsophisticated it was, but it was something around learning management content. And how many colleges went out and spent lots and lots of money buying their own individual one, and then wondered why nothing happened to it in the corner, because all of a sudden, to Don's point, nobody thought about the pedagogical interaction between that with the teaching, the learning, with the content. So I mean, I'm possibly being a bit unkind to make my point, but I think Don's made it really, really well. It's not about.
I just realised that I wrote this book.
This is a plug.
Look at this. It's not a plug. It's not a plug. But I want to point out that in the index, interestingly, in the index of this, the index entry, which has the most number of references next to it, is nothing to do with technology. It is to do with listening. So that's how you make sure your technology is implemented correctly. Actually, quick plug: if you're in China, you can now buy the book in Chinese. That just arrived today on my desk. So there we are.
Fantastic. No, that deserves a kudos to you for that. I think, just to your point, Don, if I may, you're right. I mean, I've got a view on it. We will have as learning technologists. Just quickly, LXPs, you can go to Learning Technologies, for example, see 5 or 6 different presentations of the various organizations' latest LXPs, and none of them will be the same or remotely do the same kind of things. You've got Microsoft now launching with Viva their EXP, and Totary, of course, have got their talent experience platform. So there's a lot of still mismatch of stuff going on. Emily, did you want to come in there from a digital perspective with our
well, it's less about digital. It's more about, the one positive thing that I'm seeing is that finally I feel, and we're on a journey, we're not there yet, but there's more integration between conversations between talent acquisition, HR, business, learning and development. That's what's going to make the change. It's that integrated kind of talent development ecosystem. That to me is way more important than LXPs or whatever technology you're using, and that is how we're going to drive forward those skills that we need for.
It's the listening that will drive the technology,
and it comes back to the listening, absolutely, and the talking, everyone talking together.
And unfortunately, in learning and development, we're very good at sitting in a corner and producing something beautiful, whether it's a course or a system or whatever, and expecting that to solve a problem. But the truth about work is it's much messier than that, and it requires that listening to those conversations to go out and try and just get bits of the organization stitched together to solve some problems. And one system will never solve it all, but initiatives in each place will. So I think you're absolutely spot on there.
I mean, what I would also add, though, if we do all accept, as I think we do, that the one thing that has happened through COVID is the pivot to more digital blended, and not just for those few who, or many few who would automatically naturally fall into learning that way. We've got to make it really, really accessible and easy. I mean, even in this country alone, we still have digital poverty. We still have, situations where this would be an anathema conversation to people who are working. So what are we going to do to make it as the enabler to it as easy as possible if we really are going to be successful in trying to create getting the right skills to people in the right blended way that creates a continuous learning development culture? We've still got to tackle that one.
We still have digital poverty. That's very poignantly put. Alex, next question, please.
Yeah, next one's coming from Stuart. Thank you, Stuart. And this is relating to, how you create and maintain that skills framework within an organisation. So Stuart asks, what's the panel's view on people without the skills of the individual employees actually creating and maintaining a skills framework? So, if you've got a department owning that, but they might not actually have the skills that they're sort of trying to map. No one's got every skill, right?
Go for it.
I've designed and implemented a couple of skills frameworks, and you can't have the skills. But what you do need if you're going to develop and maintain a skills framework is a combination of diplomatic skills and political skills to corral together the experts in each group. And then you need somebody, it could be the same person, with the writing or the précing skills to boil down those things into observable behaviors, which can then be described in the skills framework. Those are the skills which are important. Now, if you try to get somebody sitting in a room by themselves, conjuring up a framework that describes things they don't know about, and then foist it on the organization, it is guaranteed to fail. If you pull people together, be nice to them, but hard for them at the same time, and pull all of their great thinking into 100 words to define things, and then go out and use it, there's a chance it may succeed, not least because those people have their input into it and they have to then back it. So there's quite a lot of work to be done there, but there is a huge difference between expertise in the subject and expertise in being able to deliver a framework.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, Don. Time for one more, Alex?
Yeah,
Unless anybody else wants to come in on that?
I want to give a shout out quickly to Anna Pickles, because we haven't mentioned her, and she said investing in people could also just be giving people time to learn. I think it's a really good point, that it takes time as well as money. And I think it's something we just don't give enough emphasis to, is that people need to have the time. And that means managers have to be bought into it. Managers decide how people use their time. Managers need to know it's okay for people to use their time to learn as well as to work. Sorry.
Sorry, Emily, go for it.
I was just going to do another, a plug for Kineo actually in the learning maturity report, but that we absolutely kind of address that point, so we see sort of the maturity of learning culture as a continuum that you're working along. And there are kind of 4 stages that, that we identify an organization can be at any one time, from a young sort of learning culture, which places really little emphasis on upskilling workers, all the way through to the most mature learning cultures, where employees are actively encouraged to engage with professional development, yes, but also self-development, because we recognize that can also bring a lot to the table. And that is really factored into sort of part of just their daily routine of life. So, we know that everyone's not there yet. It's a journey, but I totally agree with the point you're making, Anna. I think that's
our next webinar is about our learning maturity report, which I shall plug duly shortly. But you're right, it's about finding time, and it's all very good to say learner-led learning is something we should take responsibility for it, but not necessarily if we're carving it out of our own time. I think. Any last thoughts from the panel? I shall sort of sum up with our closing comments, but any last words?
No, great conversation, gone very quickly, but no, I think there's been some fantastic points and some really good interaction as well.
I thought I want to say one thing. Right now, I'm putting together the program for learning technologies for next year, for February. And I am aware that the program will be very different, not just because it'll be a hybrid event, but also because the content will inevitably be different in a way it hasn't been in 21 years. In 21 years, honestly, a lot of the content hasn't really shifted. It's going to, because there are new questions which we need to answer and new challenges which we're rising to. I think this is a really exciting time to be in learning and development, helping adults fulfill their potential, whether they're coming into the workforce, whether they're over 50 and continuing to work as they will do full-time or part-time into the future. We've got a great responsibility and a great opportunity to help them.
Perhaps, Don, you can use it to try and come up with that global taxonomy we were talking about.
Yeah, I'll fix that I'll go find a 15-minute slot to do all we need in the global taxonomy. There we go.
If anyone can, Don, come on. Fantastic. Look, great discussion, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and for everybody in attendance in our audience. As mentioned, there are a couple of great resources we would recommend here. There's the Skills Index, which is available from City and Guilds Group to download now. Of course, Don, you've got your Global Sentiment Survey for 2021, which you published earlier in the year. People can visit your website. The details should be in front of everybody. And I'd like to also highlight something that Emily touched on, our next webinar in association with the e-learning industry, which is on Tuesday, the 31st of August. And in that session, we'll be exploring the learning maturity model, which we developed this year. And we'll be talking to some clients about how they've been able to mature their learning organization, their culture, and drive impact across their business. The sign-up link will be shared with you in an email follow-up along with the recording of today's session. So look, great. All that remains is for me to say thank you again for all our panelists, Don, Kirstie, Em, for your time today, for a great conversation. Thanks to everyone who joined in and who chipped in. Have a lovely evening, everybody, and thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.